If this telecast does not prove interesting, it will be wholly my fault, because the theme itself is. Namely, the life of Abraham Lincoln. One day, the President and Mrs. Lincoln went out for a ride. It was a spring afternoon. They turned into New Jersey Avenue from the White House. And as they did, Mrs. Lincoln said to him, she said, "You almost startle me with your cheerfulness." He said, "Mary, this is the happiest day of my life." There are some who think Lincoln was melancholy. Let's find out what he meant by happiness. No character is ever born great. Character becomes great. Some people's lives are flat and dull, and others have a tension and a pull. There are opposites in them, like the positive and negative poles of electricity. Moses, for example, was not always a meek man. He once killed an Egyptian. He had to become meek. John the Baptist was not always a loving man. He once asked the Lord to rain down fire from heaven upon the Samaritans. And so there was some great tension in Lincoln. And he became great because he was able to reconcile those opposites. Now, what were they? They were adversity and joy. And the two are not as opposed as it would seem. And it took a lifetime to reconcile them. First of all, adversity. He had to pay the penalty of success even as a young man. Someone has said that jealousy is the tribute which mediocrity pays to genius. They said that his simplicity was a pose, that he cultivated the manner of honesty, but that he really was not. He was slandered, for example, by his political opponent Cartwright, who called him an atheist, which he was not. And Lincoln asked his friends, he said, "Do not answer a charge." As silly as that. Many of his confreres called him the Illinois gorilla, the original baboon. Samuel B. Morse, who invented the telegraph, said that he was an illiterate without any brains. Congress at one time thought of impeaching him. He had to go before Congress once in order to defend his wife against the charge of being a spy. And after he gave the Gettysburg Address, the Chicago papers said, "The blood of every American will tingle with shame on reading the silly, flat, dish-watery utterances of one who has to be pointed out to intelligent foreigners as President of the United States." And then there were other adversities besides slander, great sorrow. When he was a young man, he fell in love with Anne Rutledge. She was only 18. She was in love, at least for a time, with a young man from the East who failed to correspond. Then Lincoln met her. She was beautiful, as fresh as springtime. He asked her to marry him. They were engaged. She was taken ill, seriously. Lincoln was the only one that was allowed at her bedside. When she died, Lincoln said, "I cannot bear the thought of rain falling on her." And he used to go out and walk through the woods near the grave, muttering strange sounds, trying to recover a belief in immortality because he had read some of Voltaire and Volney. He said one day to a friend, pointing to the grave of Anne Rutledge, "My heart is buried there." And yet, with all of that adversity, on the other side, there was something else. There was a joy. A superficial joy and a profound joy. Now, when we speak of joy, let it be understood that joy is not the same as pleasure. Pleasure belongs to the body, joy belongs to the mind. Pleasure changes with circumstances. For example, we are enjoying ourselves in one place or one condition and not in another. Joy, however, is rather constant. Pleasure changes with the years. We do not have the same kind of pleasures when we're old as when we're young. But joy remains always the same. Now, Lincoln had a joy, not a gaiety. It was superficial and profound. Superficial, first of all, and that manifested itself in a love of stories. I think that the incidents that he very often recounted were just a kind of a surface manifestation of something that was really very, very happy down deep in the inside, particularly as adversity increased. One day, Mrs. Lincoln came up to the room they left a White House reception. One of the boys was sick. She had a big, long train on her dress, low-neck dress. Lincoln looked at her and said, "Cat has a long tail tonight, dear. Might help if some of the tail were cut off and wrapped around the head." When he was debating Douglas, Douglas said, "My opponent has been a failure at everything. He was a failure behind a grocery store. He was a failure even in the forest. He was a failure even behind a bar because he sold drinks." And Lincoln said, "Yes, Douglas, and you were on the other side and not a failure in drinking them either." At one time someone said to him, "Mr. Lincoln, we've never heard you swear or blaspheme. Why is that?" Well, he said, there was never any need of swearing as long as I had Stanton in the cabinet. Two women, it said, were discussing the relative merits of Jefferson and Lincoln. And one woman said, "You know, Jefferson was a praying man." And the other one, defending the president, said, "But Lincoln is a praying man." "Yes," she said, "I know, but the good Lord can never tell whether or not he's joking." Lincoln said that he never invented a story, that he did not have a wit. He said he was just a retailer of stories. And they got him out of many, many jams and difficulties. But all these things were superficial. Sometimes they illustrated even a domestic policy. He told about a red-haired mother who had 12 children. And he said that she would spank them and whip them and so forth, but she said to her neighbors, "You stay out of this. This is my quarrel, and we settle everything in this house." And Lincoln said, "We settle everything in the United States, and we want no one interfering in our business." But then came another kind of joy. It was the joy that comes from a good conscience, from honesty, humility, and above all, a great vocation. First of all, honest. Well, of course, everyone knows him. Honest Abe. The judges of the Supreme Court of Illinois said he never knew Lincoln to practice deception. On one occasion, his political opponent, or rather his opposing lawyer in a trial, said to the jury, they call him Honest Abe. He's not honest. He's just clever. He wears a mask. He's an actor. Doesn't believe what he says. And Lincoln said, you have known me for many years. Is that true? And the lawyer bounded to his feet and said, no, it's a lie. And I take it back. One day he said to a client, he said, from the point of view of law, you have a case. From the point of view of equity and justice, you have none. And he said, you know, if I took your case and I went before a jury, my conscience couldn't be in it, and I would be saying to myself all the time that I was talking, Abraham Lincoln, you're a liar. And he said, you know, I might even say it out loud. He was associated with another lawyer who charged the client $1,000. And Lincoln said to the client, you've been overcharged. I will charge you nothing. He would never take a case which his own conscience could not defend. And then, in addition to that deep-seated honesty, was a humility. Do you ever notice today how often people will say, contradict themselves, and say, well, I'm very proud, and I say it in all humility. I've heard dozens of people receiving awards say that. Lincoln would never accept an award or an honorary chairmanship or anything that did not have some work behind it. And as regards his own conscience and his own humility, say he never cared where he slept, put down in the basement, put up in the garret. He hardly ever knew what he ate. When it was first proposed to him that he become candidate for president, he said, I'm not worthy to be a president of the United States. Had to be prevailed upon. He said his education was defective. One day a lawyer quoted Latin and said, you understand what that means, Mr. Lincoln? He said, if you're talking Latin, you'll have to ask someone else. Lincoln used to chop his own wood, and even in the White House. Shined his own shoes. And someone saw him one day shining his shoes in the White House, and he said, Mr. President, you shining your own shoes? Lincoln said, who else? And one day, or not one day, but on many occasions, he used to annoy Mrs. Lincoln considerably because he would always open the front door for the visitors. And one day Mrs. Lincoln reprimanded him. She said there was someone there to do that. And the lady was going out, said to Mrs. Lincoln, Mary, she said, if I had a husband like that, I wouldn't care what he did. The humility was real and genuine. And as the years went on, he began to see more and more that he owed everything to a power above him. And then allied with that was a sense of a vocation, which he received very early in life, and which never seemed to leave him. He went down the Mississippi as a young man, got off in New Orleans, walked around the French Quarter, Spanish Quarter, and then came to a slave market. He went in with John Hanks. There was the auctioneer standing on a cracker box. All about the room were slaves, stripped to the waist. Prospective buyers were going around, opening their mouths, looking at their teeth, judging them like they might judge a horse. Others forced the slaves to run around the room, see if they had good wind, if they were strong enough for slave labor. And others turned lecherous eyes on the women they bought. Lincoln saw husbands and wives being separated and children being torn from mothers. And he could stand it no longer. And he turned to John Hanks and he said, "Someday I'm going to hit that institution, and I'm going to hit it hard, by the eternal God." The backwoodsman. And illiterate. Talking about an institution that went back to 1437 when a Portuguese sold 10 slaves to someone in Portugal. And he, without any education, any background, was going to hit this institution. Why, a man who has a vocation like that is happy on the inside. And so the two, joy and adversity, went on through his life. And some biographers will take the joy and make him out to be a humorist, and others will take the adversity and make him out to be melancholic. No, if you see the depth of character, you see the two fusing, because the two are not inseparable, the two can coexist. It's well to remember, for example, that the only night that our blessed Lord ever sang was the night that he went out to his death. And the great discourse that he ever gave on joy, and it was the only time he ever spoke on joy, was the night that he went out to die. Paul and Silas sang in prison. There's such a thing as having joy before one, therefore being able to bear any kind of adversity. And that's the making of a great character. Any man who's been through any kind of suffering and borne up under it, has seen it come from the hand of God, he has a joy on the inside that no one can take away from him. And as time went on, it was joy that came out of this adversity and this vocation. So he had a presentiment of death, certainly. He did. He dreamed about it. He dreamt about it one night in Springfield in 1860. He was on a couch. He was looking at a mirror in the far end of the room. And he saw two faces. His own. First one, clear, lifelike. The second, dull and ghastly. He got up from his couch and walked up before the mirror. And two images vanished, came back again to his couch and looked. And there was the clear one, and there was the dull one. He went to Mrs. Lincoln, and he said, "What does it mean?" She said, "I think it means that you will finish your first term, but you will die before the second." then, 1865. One night he was very quiet. Mrs. Lincoln said to him, "You seem troubled." "Yes." Said, "I've been troubled about a dream." And he said, "What is strange is that in the morning when I woke up, I took up the Bible and I turned it over. And every page that I turned was the page about a dream or a vision, beginning with the vision of Jacob and the angels ascending and descending the ladder. And she said, "What was the dream?" He said, "I went to bed rather sad. I was worried about reports from the front. And I fell asleep, and I was not asleep very long. When in my dream I got up and I went downstairs to the first floor of the White House. And everywhere I walked, I heard people moaning, crying, and weeping. I could see no one. I went from one room into another. Not a person was to be seen. But everywhere, like the roar of a sea, a moan and a cry was going up. I went into the East Room. And there in the East Room, I saw a coffin. Round about the coffin were soldiers. And I said, "Who's dead?" And the soldiers answered, "The President of the United States. He has been assassinated." That was my dream. And then we come to the scene that we described. The day that he and Mrs. Lincoln were out for a ride. And she said, "You're very cheerful." He said, "This is the happiest day of my life." It was Good Friday. Good Friday, the day on which our blessed Lord...
It was composed by Fritz Kreisler. I once went to Fritz Kreisler and asked him if he would compose some introductory music for this show. And he said yes. He said, "I've done many pieces that I've not yet had copyright. I will give you about 30 of those, and you choose the one you want." Well, the one I liked was entitled The Vienna March. But of course, I couldn't come out marching on the stage. So I said to Mr. Kreisler, I said, "Would you please turn it into a waltz?" That didn't mean I was going to come in waltzing either. Although I do a step backstage before I come on when I hear it. And he said, "We can't put it in waltz time. It's impossible." And I said, "But Mr. Kreisler, I can't march on the stage. Please do it in waltz time." He said, "It can't be done." Well, I said, "Sit down at the piano and try it." "No, no, no." I said, "Just 2 measures." So we sat down, played 2 measures, and he said, "See, I told you, it can't be done." And with that, Mrs. Kreisler, who was sitting there, said, "Fritz is in his no mood tonight." She said, "You stay here. So Mr. and Mrs. Chrysler left the room, and they went back to another part of the apartment where there was another piano. And in a few minutes, I heard the strains of all of this coming in waltz time. And then the two of them came back, and Fritz said, "Yes, I will do it." You see, the lesson is never underestimate the power of a woman. We are talking in this telecast on temptation. Remember what Oscar Wilde said about it? I can resist anything but temptation. But not only how it starts, but rather its end phase, what is called compulsion. We often hear it said, "Oh, he's a compulsive drinker, he's a compulsive smoker, he's a compulsive thief." How does one become compulsive? Well, let us start now describing how that starts in various stages. Because of the prevalence of detective and mystery stories, I may introduce agents here and there. There is, and this is the mind, this is the top of the mind, conscious person. And down below the mind, there is considerable amount of flammable material. Now, they can be reduced to three types, this material. One, there is sex, the flesh in all of its phases. Nothing wrong here. We are just considering impulses. Then secondly, there is the ego, the desire for power. And then finally, outside of the body and outside of the mind, this is the mind here, there is also in us a desire for things. We like to have possessions, property. These impulses are good. If we didn't have this, we'd never have the family. If we didn't have this, we'd never have a desire for truth. We would not have students. We would not have legitimate ambition. We would not have physical and mental and spiritual perfection. And then furthermore, property. After all, our desire for property is really a desire to have some external guarantee of our inner freedom. I am free on the inside because I can call my soul my own, and I'm free on the outside because I can call something else, something that I have, my own. Now, these are good, but they can also be bad. They are perverted in some way. It's very much like fire. Fire is marvelous in a hearth, but it's not good in your bedclothes. And so, these are good in their proper place. After all, what is dirt? Dirt's nothing but matter in the wrong place. And so these can be sometimes in the wrong places, and then this might be a tiger, and this might be a lion, and this might be a pack rat. All right, this is the way we're constructed. And simply because now, as we get into temptation, we mustn't think because we're tempted there's something wrong with this. We're only human. The temptation very often comes from the outside. Something we see, something we hear, something we desire, whatever it may be. And now we pass into what might be called the act. So that outside of us, I'm going to call this, you see, you know I can't draw, don't you? Oh, you did? I see. Well, this is I don't know, this is a man of some kind here, and he's got a torch in his hand. See, I always explain everything. This is a torch. And this we've called Agent 006. So Agent 006 throws his torch, see, down here, and starts a kind of a fire. And when we consent, then we have what is known as the act. Now, when we consent, then we may say, well, in the first act, when we're a tiger, we say, what difference does it make? Everybody's doing it. The mores have changed. You just drink the water, you forget the glass. Because when we do wrong, we always justify. Then for power, the ego, why should anybody tell me what to do? After all, I'm a powerful engine. Why should anybody say, these are the tracks some engineer laid out for you years ago? Why follow those tracks? I'm going to make my own tracks. Well, then he discovers that he's not free to be an engine, actually. Then property. We see something that isn't ours, and this fire in here, we take it. I can remember when I was a boy, my mother liked geraniums, cheap flowers. And I was passing Madden's grocery store one day home from school. I think I was about 7. And I saw geraniums in a tin can out in front of Madden's store. And one of the cans was in a beautiful bloom. It had a nice red geranium on it. And as I went by the grocery store, I snipped a geranium. And when I got home, I said, Mother, here's the geranium. She said, where did you get it? I said, Madden's grocery store. How much did you pay for it? I said, nothing. Did Mr. Madden give it to you? No. Did you steal it? Yes. I think the geranium was marked either 5 or 10 cents for that tin can. She said, you go to your piggy bank, shake a quarter out of it, and go back and give the quarter to Mr. Madden. Well, I said, it isn't worth a quarter. Worth only a dime. Well, she said, this is to teach you not to steal any geraniums. Well, do you know that on account of that 15-cent overcharge, I've never stolen a geranium since? So this is the first stage, what is called the act. Then, once the barrier has been broken down, then it is easier to cultivate a habit. And the habit is the next stage. So that little agent 006, he now changes his number. And he's now agent 066. Because now he's on the inside, and he begins to work now on the person, and just as even silken threads are very easy to break, but if you would mix together thousands and tens of thousands of them, they would make a rope that you could not possibly break. And so a habit is a result of multiple acts. In relationship to drink, it's here, let's take a drink. That's all right. Then drinking begins to be, after a while, what might be called a kind of a habit. Now, the habit is easy enough to understand. The habit is easy enough to break. But then there comes another stage. And this is the stage with which we started. It's beyond that of a habit. It happens when, for example, now a person, after, violating the due order, for example, of the flesh, would be very much like someone who broke into 2 Long Island homes a week ago, knocked at the doors, and within an hour or two assaulted 2 young mothers. And as he broke open the front door, he said, "I'm a sex maniac." In other words, he said, "I'm under compulsion. I don't know what I'm doing." That was his excuse. And then here, power turns into a kind of a tyranny. And one becomes, under compulsion too, in regard to property, this is the 3rd stage, a kleptomaniac. This really and truly happened. It sounds incredible. A woman in a New York apartment had a pet cat, and it came to the end of its 9 lives. There's no place to bury a cat in Manhattan Island. So she called up a friend of hers in Westchester, and she said, "You have a big lawn. Do you mind if I go up and bury my pet Persian cat in your lawn?" "No, sure, come up." So the woman put the cat into a shoebox. And she decided that maybe she ought to buy the friend some handkerchiefs or something, because she was giving her burial grounds. She stopped into a department store, and as she was looking at handkerchiefs, she put the shoebox alongside of the handkerchiefs. When she'd made the purchase, lo and behold, the shoebox was gone. She called a floor walker. She said, "I had a box here, now it's gone." Floor walker said, "Don't be disturbed. Very often these kleptomaniacs, these compulsive thieves, as soon as they steal anything, they take it up to the ladies' room. So let's go up there." And there they found the box open, the dead cat there, and a woman fainted alongside of the dead cat. Well, she was a compulsive thief. So compulsion can be in any one of these stages. Now, when one reaches this stage, this agent is completely inside of the person, no longer outside. And the agent's number now is agent 666. If you know anything about symbolism and sacred scripture, you can look that up. I'm not telling you what it is. 666. It's the sign of something. Now at this stage, people will say, "I have no freedom. I'm sick." That's true. They are sick. But was their freedom completely destroyed? No, not completely. It's like the parable of the man who has a big house, and as long as he keeps the guards up, he lives in peace with his goods. But if stronger than he comes, then he breaks into the house and enslaves the owner and takes the goods. And so here there is a kind of an enslavement, a possession. And it is interesting the way these people describe this compulsion. First of all, they say they feel divided. And they do. They're pulled in opposite directions. They might say, for example, "My name is Legion." See, that would be singular. Legion, that means many. I'm many. They're torn, they're pulled in different directions, as if there was something inside of them, some power that was forcing them, almost compelling them, to do things which of and by themselves they didn't want to do. Then they will often say, "I've got a burning sensation inside of me." That's true. They do. Perhaps the best way to describe that is you put a piece of burning coal on your hand, and your hand aches, burns more than aches. It burns because there is no affinity between your hand and that hot coal. So there's disaster. So too, there's no affinity between the human personality and these excesses. And the result is that one feels burnt, destroyed, spoiled, and invaded by some power from the outside. And therefore, that is really a very good description of what goes on. Now those who say, psychiatrists who say these people are sick, well, that is true. To a great extent they are sick, but their freedom is not completely and totally destroyed. And then they are in despair. And why in despair? Because they can't see a way out. That's why some of them are driven to suicide. Now this is a tragic situation, but it's not impossible. One must remember that though there is, for example, invading here, just simply the mind here, though there is invading the self or the mind, this agent 666 that's in here, this mind of ours is not completely closed. It's possible for something else to get in. And when people are under any compulsion, you can never drive out a compulsion. Drink or anything else. You can't drive it out. You have to crowd it out. Oh, crowding out is a little different. When you crowd something out, you're putting something else in. For example, if I brought several hundred other people into this studio, it might crowd you out, but there would be several hundred other people here. So there is such a thing as the power of an expulsive affection. You have to introduce something new. Now, let me tell you a true story about this compulsive affection. Some years ago, there was a woman came to see me. She told me she was a compulsive alcoholic. She said she spent $8,000 a year on alcohol. And she said, I have been 4 times in the city hospital with delirium tremens in the past year. And she said, whenever I go on a bout, and it's very often, I lock myself in my bedroom. And I don't know what happens to the key. She said there's utter chaos after a week or 2 of this. This morning, she said, I was out walking in the park and your name came to me. So I came to see if you could do anything for me. Well, I said, I'm afraid I can't, because I